Okay, well, we've got enough people here now. I'll go ahead and officially start the meeting. And, Tom, please just keep admitting people as they show up. So welcome to this meeting of Carpinteria Birdwatchers for Thursday, March 17th, 2022. The topic for tonight's meeting is better identifications. And it's officially Better Identifications Part 1, because as I was explaining during the pre-meeting, I got so excited putting together slides for the talk on identifications that it got too long. So I've split it into, this month we're going to have Better Identifications Part 1, where we'll be talking mostly about tools and techniques for identifications. And then next month we'll do Better Identifications Part 2, where we talk about kind of reporting rarities and some of the things that can lead to misidentifications and some examples of my own recent identifications. That's why the meeting got too long, is because I have so many misidentifications that it just kept getting longer and longer. So anyway, so that's what we will do. Let's see, but before we get going tonight, there's just a few announcements. One is that this coming Saturday, we will have an outing of Carpinteria Birdwatchers. We will be going to the Carpinteria Salt Marsh Nature Park at 8 a.m. this Saturday, the 19th. And we'll meet at the entrance to the marsh, kind of towards the south end of Ash Avenue near the restrooms there. So that's where you will meet us at 8 o'clock on Saturday, and we'll get to go bird at the marsh and see what's out there, which should be a lot of fun. And what else? And the Carpinteria Little Big Day is coming up. So April 23rd, as we discussed in previous meetings, we will have a friendly 4-hour competition, or participation in whatever time frame suits you if you wish to participate in the non-competitive category. But for those competing, there will be teams of 3 to 5 birdwatchers going out between 8 a.m. and 12 noon within a 7-mile circle centered in Carpinteria. And you can find all the information about that, all the rules, all the sign up form and everything about it at the carpbirdwatchers.org website. And there is a link to the page describing the event in the description for the YouTube video where this meeting is streaming, and also on the webpage at carpbirdwatchers.org that talks about this meeting. So if you go to carpbirdwatchers.org and look around a little bit, you should be able to find that pretty easily. And all the things that I mentioned that have links associated with them are in the list of links for that, that webpage at Carpbirdwatchers for this meeting. And I think that is it for announcements. Does anybody have any exciting bird-related announcements to share before we go on with the meeting? This is your opportunity to share. So Michelle, I see your mouth moving, but you're muted. If you can unmute, maybe we'll see.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can hear you, yeah.
Okay, yeah. Just an interesting thing to share. I was walking up Linden Avenue this morning and saw the great blue heron in the middle of the field, and I could just tell he was just about to pounce on something. And so, sure enough, he got a gopher,
right.
Around a little bit, and then swallowed it whole. It's just mesmerizing for me to see that.
It is amazing, yeah.
Heron.
And they, I went to Lucky Llama, the coffee shop across the street from the library on Carpinteria Avenue, and they are nesting in that Torrey pine tree, that big pine tree.
Those are herons in the. Someone told me they were cranes, but I never seen cranes around here, so I thought it had to be herons. That's really amazing.
Yeah, great blue herons. They're nesting up there.
How lucky are we that we can go get a cup of coffee and watch great blue herons in a Torrey pine? It
was very fun.
Awesome.
Okay, so anything else before we jump into better identifications? I will mention, so I already mentioned that I split the talk into 2 parts. So I'm trying to keep it nice and short. And that means that hopefully, if I don't go on too long, at the end of this meeting, if there are particular identification challenges, bird identification challenges that you've had or that you want to discuss, there'll be an opportunity to, throw it open to the group, and you can mention whatever, whatever species pair is currently driving you nuts as you try to figure out which one is which. We can have a discussion about that. Okay, so with that said, I will go ahead and share my screen. See if this works. All right, so if I've done that correctly, you should now be able to see the orchard oriole, or a bird that will soon be revealed to be the orchard oriole as we talk about identification. Okay, so as I said, this is part one of this talk, and we're going to talk about tools and techniques for bird identification. Some disclaimers I will start with. There are many ways to be a better birder, and ID skills, identification skills are just one of those ways. And I know it gets a lot of focus, and it's an important topic if you're interested in getting your identifications correct. But I just want to make clear, as we discussed in the meeting a few months ago with Rebecca Coulter about different ways to be a better birder, this is just one sense of being a better birder. And there are many ways to be a better birder besides this. And I also wanted to mention that, this whole idea of species, of classifying birds down to the level of species, that species concept is a human invention. It's something we made up. And yes, as populations of birds get isolated over time, you tend to see related birds interbreeding with each other that are distinct from other populations of birds. And we use species as the label to describe that. But it also happens that in cases where that process is kind of just getting started in a population or hasn't gone too far, you will have interbreeding happening at the borders. You'll have hybrid swarms. You'll have these birds that are a little bit of one and a little bit of the other. And we try to assign them to a species, but it gets quite messy. And, it to me just kind of emphasizes the importance of realizing that in a certain sense, this is an arbitrary game we are playing according to rules that we have set up ourselves. And I think it's important not to let a focus on those labels keep you from appreciating the bird itself. So I try and tell myself that. In fact, this whole talk is things I tell myself about bird identification. So continuing with the disclaimers, this is not a complete discussion of the topic of how to identify birds. This is just a few topics that come up as I think about it, or as I've had my own experience of trying to become better at identifying birds over the last several years. So that's what I'm going to be talking about. If there's a topic that I don't touch on that you're interested in, by all means, interrupt and ask. We have a pretty small meeting this time. So, I have no problem with people just jumping in and asking questions. You can put questions in the chat if you don't want to interrupt the audio. But, and then, as I said, when we get to the end, if there are particular ID challenges you want to discuss, please be prepared to ask about those. And so, again, since I can't help labeling, here is the label for this bird. This is the adult male orchard oriole on Santa Monica Creek back in November of 2019. So one thing that I think it's important to appreciate is that as a birder who's kind of learning and getting started, I've had this experience many times. You go out bird watching with someone who is more experienced, and it is just amazing how they're like, oh, it's this, oh, it's that. They're identifying birds so fast and so confidently in cases where I'm not sure at all what we're seeing or hearing. It can be a little intimidating, but it's, I think, important to realize that there's a different process going on. And I have some links to a couple of articles that talk about this that I really liked when I read those articles. But one of the things they talk about is if an acquaintance of yours invited you to a work party, like to go to an event for that person's company that, where you did not work, and they were taking you through the room and they're introducing you to this person and that person and this person and that person, be like, 50 different people that they know just immediately. And they're not going through an identification process. They just know those people. They're familiar enough with them that they just recognize them through sort of a subconscious ticking off of characteristics. It's just immediate. And what you find as you gain experience with birds is that you get there yourself with the birds. Like it gets to the point where you just recognize the bird, right? You don't go through and say, well, it has this kind of beak and it has this kind of plumage and it has wing bars and it's kind of this shape. It's like, oh no, it's a northern mockingbird. I've seen them 100 times. I know that's a mockingbird. And what you'll find, as you gain experience as a bird watcher, is that you'll get that level of familiarity with more and more species, and it just happens, naturally. But the process of gaining that familiarity and that confidence is the identification phase, when you're still like going through the field guide and trying to figure out what it is that you're looking at. So that's the process I'm going to talk about, and it's a process that all of us, regardless of where we are on our individual journey, we're just going through it with different birds at any particular time. So I want to talk about resources, things you need to have. And I'm going to start with books. I know we are in the age of apps, and we'll talk about those too, but I think books are still really important. And I think it really is important for anyone who, wants to get better at identifying birds to have a good field guide. And, the two that I would always recommend are this one, the National Geographic Field Guide, with John Dunn as the author of the text, and Jonathan Alderfer as the main artist. But it's a fantastic field guide. And then also the Sibley field guide to the birds. And, I'm slightly in the Sibley camp. I'm a Sibley person. I've used the Sibley guide and love the Sibley guide for a very long time now. But the Nat Geo guide is also wonderful. And in fact, I use them both, and they each have their own strengths and are worth having. And then one thing I will say too is, if you get the Sibley guide, but if you're still in the phase where you actually want to carry it around with you in the field, the smaller Western Sibley is a little more portable, at the tragic loss of some of the illustrations. There are more illustrations in the full Sibley. So I don't know, maybe get a big Sibley for home and a small Sibley to take with you. And then apps. So in the age of smartphones, probably the app I use as much as anything on my phone is the Sibley app. And they've really done a great job of putting all that information from the book into an app. It's a little bit harder to use than the book, in the sense that you've got a little small window into that content. So it's hard to see a lot of, to really see a lot of information at one time. But I think they do a reasonable job. And again, I'm mostly using it myself for reference at this point. So I'm not in there all the time looking at it. But I would feel like my phone was incomplete without a copy of the Sibley app on it. And then another really useful app, especially in recent years, I would say, is the Merlin Bird Id app. It's from the Macaulay Library and the Cornell lab, the same people who create and maintain eBird. And I'm not going to go into detail about using the Merlin app. I don't normally use it that much myself. But I think, again, if I were at an earlier stage in my own learning process, I think this is a really excellent tool to help you narrow down your focus on what is this bird that I'm looking at. And the feature that they've added that we've talked about before in other meetings recently in the Merlin app is the Merlin Sound Id, which I think is just a huge breakthrough and very, very useful. I used it today. I was birding. We're on a vacation up in Cambria, and I heard a vocalization in some willows, and I thought, I think that's probably a Hutton's vireo, but I wasn't sure. And so I whipped out my Merlin Bird Id and I had it listen to it, and it said, oh, Hutton's vireo. And I'm like, yes, it's a Hutton's vireo. I mean, you shouldn't assume that Merlin Sound Id is always definitive. It will misidentify things fairly regularly, but it's an excellent starting point and a good confirmation. If you're already leaning that way, it can help narrow things down in a hurry. Then if you get a look at a bird, you already kind of know where you're at. So any questions about any of that stuff that I've been talking about so far? All right, hearing no questions, I'm going to keep on going.
John, let me ask you just one quick question about the
Yeah.
iBird Pro.
Yeah,
Yeah, is that, you didn't mention that one, did you?
I didn't. I do have that app and I do use it fairly often. So that's, basically another field guide app. The thing I use it for the most is that it has more sound recordings than the Sibley field guide app does. So I find it a little more useful if I really want to hear a lot of different examples of vocalizations that a bird might make. So I like it for that purpose. And with all of this, I'm talking about my own experience and I've got my own approach. It's not necessarily the best approach. Whatever works for you is what you should use. And, a big part of using these resources effectively, I think, is knowing what's in there. So you kind of know where to go to look for the information you need. Like, when I was starting off as a bird watcher when I was younger, I would spend hours just paging through the field guide and looking at all those birds and reading the descriptions and testing myself. Could I identify them without looking at the labels? And I think that's, not that everyone has to do that, but that's a useful thing to do just to acquaint you with, to help you with that initial stage of your identification where you're trying to just narrow things down to family. You're trying to say, well, is this a sparrow or is this an oriole? And being familiar enough with the different species to kind of quickly go to the right part of the field guide is a really useful skill to have.
I have a question, John. This is Lucia.
Yeah.
I've had iBird Ultimate for years, and that's the one that I go to because has all the little kind of ticks of what's similar and stuff. Is iBird Pro just an updated version of that, or?
I don't actually know. iBird Pro is the app that I have on my phone, but I haven't investigated. Does anyone else happen to know?
Okay.
I don't know. Ultimate sounds like maybe a better version, but I don't know. I don't know between Pro and Ultimate, which is the one with more features.
Okay. I was just curious because I've had it for probably 5 or 6 years now, and it's been really helpful because particularly with a similar button that I get in there, or picking up the different calls, it's a nice way to use it. But
yeah, and I'll just say that, in the Sibley app, it has a similar feature where if you look in the part of the screen that I'm indicating here, if you're looking at the species page, like this is a screenshot of the red-tailed hawk page, this little symbol in the Sibley app will show you similar species or related species. And you can click on that and you can choose one and it will show you both species at the same time. It'll show you two at once is all you can do. You can't do any more than that, which is again a way in which the app is a little bit inferior to the book, because in the book you can see a whole spread with a lot of different birds on it. But I find that really helpful. That's a really, because a lot of times that's what I'm doing. If I'm having an identification challenge where I'm going to my field guide, there's a specific pair of species that are similar, and I really want to understand, what are the characteristics that can help me determine, is it this one or is it that one?
Yeah. Well, I'm a retired librarian, and I found that all these different guides that are printed and whatever have different strengths. And so I actually have several of them, and depending on what I'm trying to figure out, I go to one or the other. But I was just curious about this one because I'll do a little.
No, I'm curious. And if you find out either before the end of the meeting or at a future meeting, let me know, because I'd be interested in knowing.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else before we move forward? Okay, I'm going to move on then and talk about steps or parts of the identification process. And this is something that I've talked about before, and I think it's a pretty important realization that at least that I came to as I was going through my own process of learning to get better at identifications. And that's that it's important to go beyond just trying to match the bird you're looking at to the picture in the field guide. I think that's that's a logical place where a lot of people start off. They've got all these pictures in the book and they've got the bird and they just want to find the one that goes with that one and they're done. And, that can work in a lot of cases, but then there are cases in which it's harder. And that approach will not get you all the way there. So I want to talk about sort of a more detailed, more methodical breakdown of the different parts that at least that I go through when I'm trying to identify a bird that's challenging for me. And I've kind of arranged these in the order that I think of them as being most important. And I see we have a participant who mentioned in the chat that iNaturalist is a good app for IDs also, where you can get input from members of the community. Like you put a photo in on Naturalist, people will weigh in on the identification for it, which is another sort of really interesting approach that I kind of talk some about more later, at least that notion of social birding. But that's a good recommendation. Yeah, I haven't used iNaturalist a lot myself, but it's probably something, I know people who do use it and get a lot out of it, and it's an important community science tool like eBird, in terms of putting data out there that has scientific usefulness, as at the same time as being a lot of fun. But to return to the identification steps. So to me, one of the most important things to think about when you're trying to identify a bird is its overall size and shape. So just, ignore the plumage, ignore the color patterns for a second, and just talk about the bird's silhouette. The first field guide that I used when I was, 8 or 9, however old I was the Peterson field guide to the birds. And one of the things that early edition Peterson had that I really loved was the end papers. Inside the covers was just a big illustration with silhouettes of different bird species and a key. And you could, try and match the number and the letter and figure out, what these birds were just based on their shape and their relative size. And it was really useful. And I think that's just a super helpful thing to keep in mind when you're looking at birds, because you can narrow things down a lot just with that. All right. And then the next thing that I would put in order of importance is the beak structure, which is really a subset of size and shape, but it's so important that I think it deserves its own bullet point. And that's just, what is the shape and size of the bird's beak specifically? And because birds, don't have hands, they don't have, they use their beaks for a lot of things that we use our hands for. They use their beaks for whatever their approach to getting food is. And so those beaks tend to be very specialized to the bird's lifestyle. And that can be really helpful. And it can kind of cut through, again, a lot of the confusion that can emerge with things like plumage, the feather colors and patterns, which can be extremely variable, between different ages of the bird or just different individuals of the species, males and the females. But their beaks are by and large going to be the same as the other members of that species. And that can be a really useful tool for, again, getting it down to the level of family and saying, okay, I know this is not a sparrow, right? This bird's beak is way too narrow and long and pointed for a sparrow type bird. So it's not a finch, it's not a sparrow, it's not a grosbeak. It's a good, helpful start way to get yourself down to closer to the actual identification. And then the next thing I would say you should think about is habitat and behavior, because you will find birds in the wrong places sometimes, but it's rare. The large majority of the time you're going to find a bird doing what that species of bird characteristically does. So if you know that, it can be really useful. It can really, again, get it down to where this is kind of part of getting to that level of familiarity that allows you to just recognize the bird. Like you can get to the point of identifying a bird just from these things, these first 3 bullets, without even considering what the color patterns on the bird are. And then plumage, color, and patterns. I don't want to just badmouth it. That's a very important thing. In a lot of cases, it's crucial to get down to the level of species. But if you've done if you've done those other steps too, it makes this part much simpler because you have a lot fewer choices to go through. And then status and distribution. And this is probably the last thing that I really came to appreciate properly in my own journey. And I really only started becoming aware of it when I got fairly serious about my birding in the last several years. So what I'm talking about here is an understanding of what birds are expected to be at the location where you are, and how common or uncommon or outright rare they might be at the current place and time. And that makes a big difference. And it's important, especially when you start talking about rarities and trying to identify these birds that you're not as familiar with. It's not too hard to recognize that a bird is unusual. Like a lot of times, if you've been birding for a while, you see something and wow, that sure looks different. Like, I don't know what that is. And suddenly you're back in this identification mode. You're not just confidently recognizing things you already know. And it's important when that happens that you have an appreciation of what are the actual possibilities here. And, how rare are these different possibilities? Are we talking about a bird that's expected to be here at this time of year, maybe, but not at another time of year? Or that might be rare, but present at this time of year, versus a bird that would be like, a first state record, which again could happen. Birds are wacky and they move around, they show up in strange places. But if that's the identification you're going to make, there's a very high bar. Like, you really need to be very sure that you've looked through everything to eliminate all the more likely possibilities. So, and you can only really do that effectively if you have a sense of the status and distribution of the different bird species. So I want to talk about how you can acquire that information. Because again, that's not just paging through the field guide, looking at pictures. That's some more in-depth knowledge that it takes time to acquire. Oh, and I'll assign a label. This is, of course, a Townsend's warbler, which is just a really gorgeous bird, which I think if it were not so commonplace where we live, at least during the winter months, we would just be, agog at how gorgeous a bird it is. There was a Townsend's warbler that showed up in, I want to say, Ohio or somewhere. And I was reading accounts of the people there going to see it, and they were just like floored by just what a gorgeous bird this was. I'm like, yeah, it really is a gorgeous bird, even though we have a lot of them. Okay, so where can you find information about status and distribution? So the first thing I would say is your field guide or your field guide app. This is the Sibley app I've got a screenshot of. Has range maps, or hopefully has range maps. And you should definitely pay attention to those. If it's winter in where we are here in Southern California, Townsend's warbler is expected to be here. If it's summer, if it's, June, July, August, it's not expected to be here, right? They're all up here breeding to the north. So if you see what you think is a Townsend's warbler, then that's important. That's an important clue that, gee, maybe I should look more carefully. Maybe it's something different. Or if it is a Townsend's warbler, that's kind of interesting information. But again, you should realize that the bar of identifying that bird is going to be higher. You're going to want to put more effort into making sure that's really what it is, because it's a very unlikely thing for you to be seeing at that time of year. And then another even more fine-grained source of this kind of information is eBird. So this is a screenshot of part of a page on the eBird website. And I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail, but this is the kind of thing I do a lot of to get an appreciation of what birds are around when. So what I did here is I went to eBird, I found the page in eBird for the Townsend's warbler. And then in the upper left-hand part of a species page in eBird, it'll start off by saying data for world, but you can click on that and you can enter another location. And so I input Santa Barbara, which in this case means Santa Barbara County. This is like the county region level in eBird. And it then shows you data specific to Santa Barbara County. And in particular, it shows you this weekly bar chart. And this shows up in some other places in eBird too, and I've talked about them a lot in the past. But it's a really nice way of seeing, throughout the year, and each of these is a different month, so January, February, March, in Santa Barbara County, what is the expected rate of occurrence in submitted eBird lists for that species? So you can see, if it's April and May, we still expect to be seeing Townsend's warblers. If it's June, early June, maybe a few of them still, but by late June and July, we would not expect to see them at all. Like, they just don't show up normally. But then, mid-August to late August, they're showing up again in the fall as they come south. So that's a really useful place to get that kind of information. And then in the eBird app, when you're entering data in the field, this is, again, you get access to this status and distribution information in the following way. So I'm in here, I'm in my eBird app, I'm entering a checklist in the field, and I've typed in TOWA, which is the banding code for Townsend's warbler. It's like an abbreviation sort of. And that pops up Townsend's warbler as one of the choices. It also happens to pop up this other choice, Townsend's hermit warbler hybrid. And that's not that important. But what I want to show you is it has this red dot associated with it. And what that means in eBird is that there's this thing called likely species that it displays for you. And it's based on, in this case, 167 checklists that were submitted in a 20 by 20 kilometer area, just checklists submitted in the area. The red dot showing up in a species means that species has not been reported lately in the area. So it's an indication to like, oh, maybe this is a rarity. Maybe this is something I should take a second look at and make sure I'm confident about what I'm identifying. If it doesn't have anything like that, that's more an expected species. So that's a good, hint to you that that is a species that would be expected to be around. And then one other thing you will see sometimes in eBird is this orange box with the R in it. And that means that species has tripped the rarity filter that's been set up by the volunteer reviewers in eBird. And so what that means is eBird is going to prompt you to input information about that species, more detail, in order to support the report. So that you want to, it's just telling you, do you really want to be sure about this? And that doesn't mean you shouldn't report it. It's an interesting bird. If it really is that rarity, reporting it in eBird is a great way to get the word out about it. But it's just letting you know you should document that sighting. And we'll talk about that more later and talk about it more in the part 2 of this meeting that we're going to have later at next month's meeting. But I'm just, again, pointing that out. That's feedback you get as you're entering birds in the eBird app about how rare or commonplace that species is. And then there's this resource, which I cannot gush about enough. This is the birds of Santa Barbara County. And Paul Lehman was someone who studied biogeography at UC Santa Barbara. And for his thesis, his graduate thesis, he wrote this book on basically giving the distribution of every bird species in Santa Barbara County. And in the years since that was published, he's continued to update it. And these days, I think he's updating it pretty much every year. But it's available for free. Anyone can download it. There's a link to it in the links for this meeting. And I refer to this all the time. It's just an amazingly detailed resource. If you want to know, for every species of bird, and here's just a little sampling for the Townsend's warbler, the species we've been talking about. This is just a very small part of the entry for Townsend's warbler. So he explains in detail where it occurs, and he's split the county up into these different districts. And I'm not going to go into it all in detail, but for someone like me, this is a really fun read. This is like, wow, I can find out this very definitive information about exactly where and when Townsend's warbler occurs in the county, and not just Townsend's warbler. I mean, every species that's ever occurred or it's been reported in Santa Barbara County. Okay. So with all that, you should have access to some really good information about status and distribution. Let's see, something else in the chat. Oh, so the half circle in the eBird checklist. Yeah, it's just an intermediate level of rarity. So like an orange circle that's half filled in, that's a species, I don't know what the actual cutoff is, but that's a species that has been reported within that local grid area, but not often. It's an unusual species. It's not rare enough that's going to prompt you to input the rarity information. It has been reported, but just so you're aware, it's less frequently reported is what that little half circle means. Okay, so we were just talking about this bird in the pre-meeting. So I want to talk about this sort of, I call it social birding, but this thing where you birdwatch not just as an individual activity, but as a group activity, and not necessarily, a group of people together in the field, but I mean, as part of this larger effort where you are reporting things that other people see. And, to me, it's kind of an interesting historical shift that's happened, because back in the early days when I started birdwatching, photography and audio recording in the field were really rare. Like that was, with film cameras, and just the process was, it was expected that people were not going to be documenting the birds they were reporting with photographs or sound recordings. So what you had to do was you had to carefully observe them and describe very clearly what it was you saw that made you believe you had identified that species. And your reputation was very important. There was this whole, there still is to some degree, but it was much more a thing back in like the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s when I was starting off as a bird watcher, that you did not want to get a reputation as someone who reported birds that then other people were not able to re-find when they tried to go find them. Like you'd get referred to or thought of as a stringer, was the term for someone who seemed to always get these really good birds, but only when no one else was around. And, I think some of the legacy of that era is still with us. And I think in some sense, it's a little harmful in terms of making people feel uncomfortable about reporting things that they've seen, or feeling like they're not going to be believed. And I don't know. I mean, I misidentify birds a lot, and less so than previously. And the process of birding socially, birding in this way where other people can review what you're reporting and give you feedback on it, I think is really useful and has been really helpful for me in becoming a better birder, or better at identifying these species, especially rare species that I'm not that familiar with. But it's just, I don't know, it's a thing. And I just wanted to kind of mention it as something that, all of us as birders, as social birders are still navigating and dealing with on some level. But today, things really have changed. And I think technology has been part of that change. These so-called super zoom digital cameras are much more available. And, relatively, at least to the days of film photography, it's much less expensive to go out there and just, take hundreds and hundreds of photos and cull them down to the few that show the bird that you saw. And this has made a big difference in my own approach to bird watching. Again, not necessarily for everybody. Some people don't want to mess with a camera, but if you're willing to mess with a camera, it's very useful. And it doesn't have to be great photography. My photographs are not great art, but they're very useful to me in terms of helping me identify birds, and especially helping me document birds that are rare. And you can get just a small pocket digital camera with maybe a 10 times optical zoom for a couple $100, which is, not negligible. But if you're interested in bird watching and spending a lot of time and you can afford that, it's a really useful thing to add to your binoculars and your field guide, specifically to help you document the birds you see that maybe the identification is a little more challenging for you. Because having that photograph that you can then refer to, at least for me, and be able to put the field guide and read the species description of the field guide while looking at a photo that's not moving around and disappearing into the underbrush is really useful. And again, if you're talking about rarities, it's very useful in terms of other people, being able to confirm, like, yep, that really is what you saw there. That was really the rarity that you reported. And similarly, any smartphone these days, you can make a recording. And if the bird is vocalizing loudly enough or close enough to you, even without an extra microphone, you can get an identifiable audio recording of that. And that can be really, really useful in the same way as a photograph. So all this just makes it much easier to get and share definitive rarity documentation. So, to me, this means that the era in which you had to scrupulously safeguard your reputation as a good observer, it's less important now than it used to be. Like, you can be a relatively sloppy observer and still get away with it because you can document it, because you can share a photo, and then, you know, I mean, it's not good to be sloppy, but it's less a thing. It's less a, you know, it's not, you don't have to view it as a moral failing if you have difficulty identifying a bird. It's like, hey, I saw this interesting bird. I think maybe it's this. Here's a photo. What do you experts think it might be? Is, you know, an avenue you can take that kind of takes a lot of that pressure off. So this is an Enna's hummingbird, quite an attractive specimen. Okay, so, so for the last part of this talk, I just wanted to share some things I'd done with bird photography, or come to appreciate with taking photos of birds, specifically as it relates to identification, that I just found interesting. You know, and again, these are not artistic photos. These are not going to show up in Audubon magazine anytime soon, but I thought they were interesting. Oh, so one thing I want to talk about, Allen's and Rufus hummingbirds, and specifically the males of the Allen's and Rufus hummingbird, which can be, you know, kind of a challenging identification. You know, the standard advice on that is for the adult, for the non-adult males, for the males that are immature, or for the female birds of any age, Allen's and Rufus hummingbirds really are not safely identifiable in the field. You know, you can assume that they're Allen's for much of the year around here. In migration, especially during spring migration, we get a lot of Rufuses. Like right now, we've got a lot of Rufus hummingbirds coming through Santa Barbara. But again, if it's not an adult male, you probably, well, I mean, the advice is you shouldn't try and identify it in the field. There are certain things you can see when you're banding. You know, when you've captured the bird and you're holding it in your hand, you can look at very specific characteristics of individual feathers that can probably help you distinguish between the females and immature males. But with the adult males, you can look at the back of the bird. If you get a really good look at the back of the bird and it's a solid Rufus, pretty much top to bottom, maybe just a few green feathers at the base of the wing, that's a good indication that it's a Rufus hummingbird. If it has extensive green in the shoulders, that's an indication it's probably an Allen's hummingbird, although not always, because a significant fraction of the Rufus hummingbird males have green on their back. So you're kind of back in the, you know, probably an Allen's, but possibility, especially at the right time of year, that it's a Rufus. And one specific way to distinguish the adult male Rufus and Allen's that's definitive is their tail feathers, the shape of specific tail feathers, which historically was, you know, thought of as something you can't normally do in the field. Like, again, that's something you're going to see in the bird when you're banding it and you can hold it and examine it up close. But that was before the advent of ubiquitous digital photography. So here is the specific feather difference that I want to show you. So this is from something called the Feather Atlas, which is from the US Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's a fabulous resource that I've used a lot of times. They basically will show you individual feathers. If you come across a feather out there while you're bird watching, and you can, you know, photograph it or get it next to a scale so you can get accurate measurements of it, you can probably find it in the Feather Atlas. And it's a very fun way to kind of figure out exactly what species you're looking at. So these are the tail feathers of Allen's hummingbird on the right and Rufus hummingbird on the left. And these are just one side of the tail. So this is the central tail feather over here on the far right. It's called the R1 feather, R for rectrix. The tail feathers are called rectrices. But R1 is the central tail feather. And birds typically have, you know, 5 tail feathers on each side. So this is showing you just one side of the tail. So here's the center tail, the R1 feather. Here's the one next to it, the R2, R3, R4, and R5. And then here's the same feathers for Rufus hummingbird, you know, R1, R2, R3, R4, and R5. And there's some distinct differences. For one thing, the R5 feather, the outermost tail feather in the Allen's, is this little thin, like almost like a little, you know, very, very narrow, like a pin, like very narrow feather. Whereas the Rufus hummingbird's R5 tail feather, it's a little broader. I mean, it's still narrow, but it's not like this narrow. But then the other thing that's really clear is this notch. So in feathers, if this outer vein, it kind of has this little indentation, and that's called an emargination. And then on the inner vein here, this is called a notch. But the result of both of those is that the tip of this R2 feather is this little, it's got this weird notch thing going on, but only in the Rufus hummingbird. The Allen's hummingbird does not have it. So this is sort of the definitive way of distinguishing between your Rufus hummingbird male and your Allen's hummingbird male, is whether or not the R2 tail feather has that notch. So that was a very long explanation. You've either all been very patient or you've all checked out and you're out bird watching, because this is really dull, but I want to go on to the actual photos. So, just a few weeks ago, this is a hummingbird that was flying over at Santa Monica Creek near my house, and I was able to take these photos. And at one point it faced away, and I got this photo that showed its whole back. So I was kind of on safe ground already. But before that, I was really interested in trying to get photos of these tail feathers. And in fact, you can see the notching. You can see that, like, here is its, you can really just see the left side of its tail in this shot. But here's that R5 and R4 and R3, and here is R2, and there is the notching. There is that little narrow tip that it has. And there's the R1, the central tail feather, and then on the other side, they're all kind of smushed together, so you can't see it as well. And same thing in this photo. Here are the R1 feathers on each side of the tail. And then the next one, you can kind of see it, it's a little fuzzy, but there's the R2 feather with that notch going on. And the same thing on the other side of the tail. There's that notch and the emargination on the outer vein. So I just thought that was very cool. That, you don't have to actually net the bird in a mist net and look at it in your hand. You just have to sit there for a while and get a lot of photos of it out. It was catching gnats. It was fly catching, right? It was catching these little gnats out of the air. But every now and then it would spread its tail. And if you're just sitting there, with a digital camera, you can just shoot off hundreds and hundreds of photos and just throw most of them away. But you occasionally get one that actually shows that structure. So I thought that was cool. And then here's an Allen's hummingbird a couple different times doing kind of similar things where it's spreading its tail out. And you can see, I'm not exactly sure which feather is which here. I think this is the R1 and this is the R2. But whichever one it is, there's no notch, right? And same thing over here. I think these are probably I think the R1s maybe are on top of each other here, and this is the R2. And the outermost, the R5 is visible on this side, but here it's kind of overlapping. Anyway, no notches on the R2s. So you can see that it's got those Allen's hummingbird tail feathers. So for me, that was very exciting. As I'm describing it now, I realize, like, that's kind of a weird thing to be excited about, but I thought it was very fun. All right, so I'm going to go on to one more species and talk about fun with photos. So this is an interesting challenge. So in the winter in Santa Barbara County, we get a lot of lesser scops, and occasionally we get a few greater scops. And lesser and greater scop females and males, but in this case females, are really similar and very hard to distinguish between each other, at least for me. And they've always been one of those hurdles that I just couldn't bring myself to get across. It was just like, I would do this thing where I wanted to include greater scop in my county year list, because I'm working on making my county year list as big as it can be. But I was trying to get them by standing next to a very good bird watcher who could tell them apart, who could tell me, oh, there's the greater scop, there's the lesser scop, and be like, okay, I've seen the greater scop. But I was kind of cheating. I wasn't really identifying it myself. So a few weeks ago, out at UCSB's Campus Lagoon, this was happening. There was a big flock of lesser scops with a few greater scops mixed in. I was like, I really need that bird for my year list. I got to go actually hunker down and do this. So I went out there and spent some quality time sifting through those scops. And it was just an interesting process for me personally. Like, it was sort of the way I described it, someone who was kind of like hate watching a TV show, like where there's a show you don't want to watch because you dislike it, but you watch it anyway so you can complain about it to people you hate watching. So I was like hate birding. I was going there to see these greater scops, even though my heart wasn't really in it. But as I did it, I actually got more into it and started to really enjoy it. So what this shows you is a greater scop on top and a lesser scop kind of out of focus on the bottom. But the main difference that's visible in these shots is the lesser scop's head is kind of taller and narrower when you look at it in profile view like this. And the greater scop's head is kind of wider and sort of, more rounded. And on the lesser scop, the feathers on the crown are longer and tend to form this kind of poofy, not a crest exactly, but this longer, crown feather area that then turns into kind of a corner at the back of the head. And it's subtle, but in the greater scop, it doesn't really do that. The crown feathers are kind of shorter, and it means that the peak on the top of the head is farther forward on the head. And this is one of those characteristics that can be tricky. It's like you look at it and it seems like every bird I'm looking at that was a candidate was kind of smack dab in the middle between those two extremes. The field guide, it looks very clear, but in the actual bird in the field, it's not so clear. But with photos and study, it was like, what? I think I'm actually seeing that. Like most of the birds I'm looking at have this kind of tall, narrow head, but these couple of them out there have this sort of wider, more rounded head. Here's another shot, again, with a greater scop in the back and a lesser scop in the front. You can kind of see the same thing going on. And what this shot shows is also this additional feature. The tip of the bill has this dark nail area, it's called. And on the greater scop, the nail tends to be wider. Like I don't really have a good shot of the lesser scop, but its nail tends to be a little narrower, dark area when it's looking head on at you. So, if you're looking at these pictures and you're like, they all look the same, this is ridiculous. I mean, that's kind of where I was coming from in my resistance to actually embracing the level of detail you had to get to successfully distinguish these birds. But then, and there's one more characteristic that is really useful, which is these birds have a white stripe in their wings when they spread their wings out. And the white stripe looks a little different in the greater scop. So I was waiting for them to stretch their wings. Sometimes they'll flap their wings on the water, and if you've got your camera ready, you can get a shot of that. That didn't happen. But then some, the rowing shells came out. They were doing rowing practice on the lagoon there at UCSB, and the scops took off, and I started flying around, and I was able to get some flight photos. And I was just, squeezing off shots. I had no idea where the greater scops had gone. There were like, 60 lesser scops and only 2 greater scops that I could see in there when they were on the water. So I was just hoping that I would get some flight shots that showed them, and this one does. And so what you see here is, this is a greater scop at the back, and these other 6 birds are all lesser scops. And the difference in the white stripe on the wing, and again, it's subtle, and this has driven me nuts as I've tried to get better at recognizing this, is that on the lesser scops, the white stripe on the wing starts off white, and then it becomes more of a grayish, becomes darker right around the point where you go from the secondaries to the primaries, right about the middle of the wing. There's this transition that happens, right? And if you look at all these lesser scops in flight, you can see all of them have it. It's white, 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 and then it's a little darker, it's a little gray, and there's a transition right about the middle of the wing. On this bird, it doesn't do that. It still starts off white and it ends up at gray, but it's not like there's a hard transition in the middle of the wing. The white part extends a little further, and that's enough to be this distinguishing characteristic of the greater scop. So, and then the other thing I realized I could do with the photo is I could actually make a really pretty precise measurement of the length, of the relative length of these birds. So it's called the greater scop because it's a little bit bigger, right? And the lesser scop is a little bit smaller. And if we back up to those earlier images, you can kind of see that, like the greater scop looks just a skosh bigger than the lesser scop in each of these earlier shots. But it's subtle, and it's not like they're swimming next to a yardstick. But in this flight photo, I was actually able to go in and just measure down to the level of how many individual pixels on the photo each of these birds were. And since they were going right across my field of view, they were all kind of stretched out. I was able to make these measurements. And the 6 birds on the left were between 139 and 147 pixels in length. And the 1 bird on the right was 152 pixels in length. So if you do the math on that, that's a ratio of 0.944. Well, in Sibley, when he talks about the length of these two species, which again, they're in those field guides, they're doing an incredible amount of work to try and get these numbers. They go to look at, study specimens in museums and look at measurements of hundreds or thousands of birds. The ratio is 0.932. So that's, to me, that was close enough. I was like, yeah, that one that has the right wing stripe is actually a little bit bigger. So, and the amount that it's bigger is roughly correct. And there's a question in the chat, could it be the age? And I assume you're talking about the size difference. And I think probably not. So the deal with birds is that, when they fledge and leave the nest, they are pretty much full-sized once they're out there in the world. And, they don't really change size so much throughout the rest of their lives. Anyway, so I thought that was fun. At the end of it, I thought it was fun. At the beginning, I was kind of gritting my teeth. It was like eating my vegetables. But at the end, I decided I actually liked the vegetables. And so, I was able to feel much more confident about my ability to actually pick out a greater scop in a big flock of lesser scops. All right, so that is it for part one of better identifications. I am, as I said, I'm happy to get, to take some time and look at, if there's particular bird ID challenges that you want to, explore or talk about, we can do that. We don't have to do that, but I'm open to that idea. So this would be a good time to bring that up. And just in general, I'm opening the floor to whatever questions people have.
How about lease and Western sandpipers?
Excellent, challenging ID, which I know you've been dealing with out there at the salt marsh. We're doing that ongoing survey in the western part of the salt marsh. Yeah. Sure. Let's see, what's a good way to do this? Let me share my screen again, and I will we'll go to eBird is what we'll do. So let me do that. Because that's a good way to look at comparisons like that. So, I would encourage you to go to your field guide and study, what it says about these species comparisons. Yeah, that's fine. And, to me, having the Sibley guide or the Nat Geo guide, it's like having David Sibley or John Dunn out there with me, because those field guides condense just an amazing amount of knowledge that they've accumulated. I've been fortunate enough to be standing next to John Dunn out in the field looking at birds. In fact, I think my whole experience with greater and lesser scops, I think I was standing next to John Dunn when he identified the greater scop for me a few years ago. And it's just an amazing thing to be able to take advantage of. But you can get pretty darn close to that if you read carefully through their accounts in the field guide. So here we are on the least sandpiper page in eBird, and let me demonstrate what I was talking about before with the status and distribution. So I clicked on where it says world, and I'm going to type in Santa Barbara and choose that choice. And now what it will give me is this histogram of its frequency throughout the year. So you can see that for least sandpipers, we have them in Santa Barbara County most of the year, just right in the middle of the summer, May, June, July, the numbers get much less, right? Because most of them are up breeding in the Arctic at that time, and only a few of them stick around. But the rest of the year, like where we are now, they're pretty frequently out there, right? And the thing you're going to see with the least sandpiper, if you're close enough to it, is one of the best characteristics is the yellowish legs. You have to be careful, because if they're walking around in goopy dark mud, their legs can look black if they're covered in mud. And you have to be pretty close to really pick that out. At a greater distance, you can see things like the beak structure. It has kind of a pointier beak than a Western sandpiper, which is the other small peep species that we have around here. kind of looking at different plumages. This is more of the winter plumage look that we see. Again, you can see the yellowish legs, kind of characteristic beak structure. They're kind of dark on top, and in comparison with a Western sandpiper, the least sandpipers tend to be darker in the throat and breast area. This shading down here is more of a least sandpiper look. There's a juvenile, which we won't see till the fall. There's a breeding adult, which again, we won't probably, well, you might start to see them looking more like that as we get closer to breeding time. I'm not sure when the actual transition is that they'll start looking that way. It's an interesting question you can answer in eBird, or you can look in your field guide and it will tell you. Another juvenile. Non-breeding adults are more of the winter plumage. Again, kind of see those characteristics we were talking about. Another thing they have is that if you see them in a mixed flock with some Western sandpipers, the least sandpipers are a little smaller, not surprising given their name, and they kind of have this sort of hunched posture. You see them kind of more lower to the ground a little bit than the Western sandpipers. It's subtle, but if you get a chance to see them up close where you can see the leg colors and other features to really distinguish them, look for that, because that's a good help that will, a good thing to get under your belt. So when you see them later at a greater distance, you can pick that out. Okay, let's look at the Western sandpiper. So I'm going to expect you to keep all that in your head. I'm not really going to put them side by side because that's a little tricky for me to do with the screen sharing. But that's something you could do yourself if you spent more time on it. Okay, we're going to change species. We're going to go to Western sandpiper. And again, it's just a quick shortcut to type the 4-character Bander code. Pick that. And here it is. So, and in fact, it's already giving us the data for Santa Barbara. So if we go down and look at its histogram, kind of similar. It's got these bulges in the spring and in the fall when it's more numerous. We're starting to get a lot of them now. We're just kind of coming into the fat part of the spring migration here. So you'll start to see more of those Western sandpipers locally. Again, numbers get smaller in the prime breeding time, although there's still some around. And then a big, much more common in the fall, where we see it showing up in a lot more checklists. But let's look at some images. So, this kind of look, here's a breeding adult, which is not the way they're going to look right now. But if you see them looking this way with these kind of, reddish marks here and on the head, that's helpful. The beak is a little bigger and a little more blunt tipped than the least sandpiper. It's variable. It's a little droopy a lot of the time. Some individuals have shorter beaks, some have longer beaks, but in general, it's got a little more beak going on than a least sandpiper, and it's a little less tapered to the tip. It's a little less sharply pointed than the least sandpiper. And then the legs, the legs are really black. Okay? And again, you see it's kind of light here in the throat and on the breast. That's a different look than what we saw in the least sandpiper. Okay? Let's look at a few more examples. So here it is in its non-breeding adult plumage. And so this is sort of what I think of as our classic winter Western sandpiper. And you can see, again, if you're focusing in on this part of the bird, that's a very different look than the least sandpiper, right? This bird is lighter on the upper parts than the least sandpiper. The legs are black, not yellowish. Beak is, as I say, there's a range of variation, but this whitish throat and not as much of a, the least sandpiper would be kind of darker in this whole area than the Western sandpiper is. Again, this is non-breeding immature, so bird we might see in the fall. Here's a juvenile. So yeah, this is again a bird you're going to see in the fall when they're coming through, and all these feathers are really crisp and new. If you start, like with shorebirds, some of the trickier IDs, you really want to, if you can get this close a look, you can age the feathers, and you can really say, oh wow, all of this bird's feathers are relatively new, right? It doesn't have any worn scapulars, the coverts. These are all very fresh feathers, and that's a juvenile bird, right? That's a bird that just hatched, so all its feathers are young. So that can be helpful to kind of narrow down what you're looking at. And then actually that one, has sort of the classic sort of large version of the Western sandpiper bill. Like, no least sandpiper is going to have that much beak on it. It's long and droopy. in a way that the least sandpiper is not going to have, and the blacklegs. So, these are things that kind of seem subtle at first or hard to distinguish at first, but it's just a question of, really focusing on it. And again, getting a good look, hopefully close to the bird. Again, at a distance, I'm putting down peep species on my checklist a lot of the time. But when they're up close and you can start ticking through these different things. And again, I would encourage you kind of go through all that list of all 5 things that I talked about. Talk about the shape and size, talk about the beak characteristics, look at the plumage, know where we're at in terms of status and distribution and the time of year, look at its behavior, try and put all those clues together, and you can get to a better identification. It's kind of like having a trial. You don't want to convict somebody based on just one piece of evidence. You want to, be a good juror and consider everything, right? And think about what's the weight of all of that evidence, which identification does it lead you towards? So I don't know, is that helpful?
That's very, very helpful. And Laurel had mentioned to me the bill, is that the Western Sandpiper has a little tip on the bill? Or is it?
Yeah, it tends to have a little, almost like a little bulb on the end sometimes.
Okay.
I mean, it's a subtle thing, but in my mind, when I think about poking myself with a least sandpiper bill, I feel like that would hurt more than poking myself with a Western sandpiper bill. It's just a little bit blunter.
Okay.
And then somebody mentioned in chat, least versus Sanderling. So that's a good question, and that's one of those that, for a long time, I just lumped them all together. I'm just like least sandpiper, Western sandpiper, Sanderling. They're all those little birds. They're just too hard. I'm not going to bother. And then as I started to bother, it turns out it's not impossible. You can actually, find some differences. And one thing is that Sanderlings really are noticeably bigger. If you have a Sanderling next to some Western sandpipers, it's a bigger bird. It's a good, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch longer, maybe. I mean, which doesn't sound like much, but on a bird that size, it's a real noticeable difference. So Sanderlings are very light on top, right? They're in their winter plumage. And behaviorally, Sanderlings are going to mostly be the ones you see running up and down at the edge of the surf. And Westerns will do that sometimes to some degree, but a tight little flock doing that all at once, that's probably Sanderlings. You should be thinking Sanderling. In their non-breeding plumage, they're relatively light gray on top. This little dark mark at the front of the wing is a Sanderling characteristic. Here's a juvenile, which again, we're not going to see until later in the year. This is a September bird. Non-breeding adult in flight. The beak is really straight. So, none of that kind of droopiness that a Western sandpiper could have. But yeah, I mean, I would say, it's a lighter bird overall in its non-breeding plumage than a least sandpiper. A least sandpiper is actually a fairly dark bird on its upper parts. But this is one of those things, when you go out to where both of them are occurring, just try and get some good close-up looks and figure out which one you're looking at and just study them. Just spend time kind of cataloging, this is what they look like. And then, as you spend more time doing that, you'll get to that level of recognition where it seems much more obvious, like the person at work. You don't have to say, oh, is that Jim or is it Bob? He's wearing the red shirt or the white shirt. It's like, no, it's just Jim. You just recognize him right away.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was an excellent question. And then they get this very different look, this kind of breeding adult look that Sanderlings get that, is pretty distinctive, just with those reddish feathers all over the whole bird or the upper part of the bird. There's a juvenile with that really speckled look. See those in the fall. This is, again, a September bird. And here they are doing their thing, running in and out with the sand, with the surf on the sand. Okay. Any other questions? Happy to talk about some other IDs. If not, I guess it's too dark to really go birding unless you want to go listen for owls. But I want to thank you all for coming, and we'll talk more about this next time. You know, at next month's meeting, I want to go into kind of more about my own history of misidentifying birds and show you some examples of birds I've misidentified, which, you know, I'd like to say I could only find those if I went back a long ways in time, but no, I have recent examples I can show you where I posted something to eBird and said, oh, it's this. And it turns out, yeah, actually, no, it's not that. So, and that's something I find interesting. I mean, I'm sort of interested in the process. How did I get to making that misidentification, and how can I do a better job of not doing that in the future? And I will share some of that next time. Okay, well, anything else? Last chance? All right, well, thank you all very much. I always have a lot of fun doing these, and I look forward to them. And I hope you will come out on Saturday at the Carpinteria Salt Marsh. And I hope you will, you know, put together a team or just go out individually on the Little Big Day on April 23rd. And we can see how many birds we can find in Carpinteria in 4 hours, which I think will be a lot of fun. All right, well, thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Thank you. Thanks, John.
See you next time.